This is Intercepted. I'm Jeremy Scahill coming to you from Dropsite News, dropsitenews.com, and there is breaking news that a potential deal is being reached between Israel on the one hand and Lebanon on the other. And of course, it's being framed as the Israel-Hezbollah deal, but the Lebanese government is also very much a stakeholder in the outcome of this, and the sovereignty of the nation state of Lebanon is being prioritized, we understand, by all parties involved with this on the Lebanese side. Benjamin Netanyahu came out and gave a speech on Tuesday evening in which he essentially tried to declare some sort of victory. He said that by reaching a truce with Hezbollah and Lebanon, that it's going to free up Israel now to focus its war machine on Iran, to regroup, to rearm, and also to focus on what Netanyahu has characterized as a war of annihilation against Hamas in Gaza. Of course, on the ground, this is not actually a war against Hamas. It's a war against the Palestinian people of Gaza. And we're going to be talking about what all of this means for the Palestinians of both Gaza, the West Bank, and Jerusalem. But first, just some background, because if this deal is made and it is between Israel and Lebanon, it means that there is no resolution in sight for the scorched earth genocidal war against Gaza. And there's a lot of questions about what this will mean for the Palestinian people. This U.S. war, U.S. facilitated war that Israel is waging, has now reached its 416th day. President Biden has 55 days left in his term as president, and he has made quite clear that he intends to leave office with Gaza burning. It's like we're witnessing a macabre farewell tour of an American politician who has spent more than a half a century in political office supporting, endorsing, and facilitating Israel's worst crimes against the Palestinian people. And Biden's refusal to use the full power of the White House to shut down this genocidal war has now created a reality where Donald Trump takes power with the Israeli state's killing machine more emboldened than it has ever been since its founding and the unleashing of the Nakba. And, of course, Donald Trump's rhetoric and that of his nominees for key national security positions may sound more extreme than some of the framing that we've heard from top Biden administration officials with their platitudes about concern for Palestinian lives. But let's be clear that this has been a bipartisan U.S. policy. And even though Biden is going to be leaving 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, his legacy is going to live on whatever moves the Trump administration makes. And some Democrats are already trying to distance themselves from this. And they want to pivot to, this is Donald Trump supporting the extremist right-wing government of Benjamin Netanyahu. But history is going to remember that anything that comes after Biden's presidency was set up by everything that they did while they were in power. And they knew that Donald Trump had a very solid chance of winning that election. They knew that his single greatest campaign contributor, Miriam Adelson, who gave $100 million to a Trump-aligned PAC, has advocated for the official annexation of the West Bank and is a passionate supporter of the genocidal war in Gaza. So you look at Trump's cabinet and you can say, oh my God, this is going to be a horror show for the Palestinians. That's what it's been for the entire past year under a Democratic administration led by Joe Biden and by Kamala Harris. So there's a lot of questions on the table, and I'm really honored to have our next guest here with us to answer questions like, what is going to happen now with the Palestinians of Gaza if there is a truce or a deal that actually sticks in Lebanon? How is that war going to end? What is going to happen in Gaza once we move into a different phase? Is Gaza even going to be a Palestinian territory where Palestinian people live anymore? What are the prospects now for an actual Palestinian state? Who are the political leaders that are going to emerge from it? To discuss all of these questions, I'm joined now by Dr. Sami Al-Arian. He is the director of the Center for Islam and Global Affairs at Istanbul Zaim University. Sami is originally from Palestine, but he lived in the US for 4 decades, and he was a university professor in Florida. And I'm sure some of our listeners are familiar with his story. Under the George W. Bush administration, Dr. Sami Al-Arian was subjected to a roughly decade-long legal persecution and portrayed very publicly by the Bush administration as a dangerous terrorist, as a leader of Palestinian Islamic Jihad in North America. He was charged with more than 50 counts, and the case at its core was a political attack waged by Bush's Justice Department as part of a wider assault on the rights of Muslims in the United States. That legal case against Dr. Sami Al-Arian was flimsy. Prosecutors largely sought to portray his protected First Amendment speech and his charitable activities as terrorism. And at the trial, and this is so important for people to understand because Sami Al-Arian gets attacked regularly, at the trial, the government failed to win a conviction on any of its charges. And years later, Sami Al-Arian eventually agreed to take a plea deal to bring an end to this legal harassment. And he did that at the encouragement of his family as well. And as part of that deal, Sami Al-Arian left the United States, but he does join me now from Istanbul. Sami, thanks so much for being with us.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
So we have this breaking news with the caveat that things can change very, very fast. We're recording this on Tuesday afternoon, East Coast time in the United States. But let me just get your initial response to what Benjamin Netanyahu said when he came out and urged his ministers to accept what he called a ceasefire deal. He said that this is going to free Israel up to focus on Iran. He said it's going to allow them to regroup and rearm themselves and to then put a more intense focus on totally destroying Hamas in Gaza. Talk a bit about where things stand right now in your analysis.
Well, it's very important to understand that Israel has been defeated in its confrontation with Hezbollah. Why do I say that? Because we have to go back and look at what Israel declared as its political and military objectives. It sought Hezbollah to be totally defeated and annihilated. That was not realized. That failed miserably. It sought to push Hezbollah north in the north of Litani so that they will not be a military effective militia or group, and that hasn't been achieved. They sought to stop Hezbollah's attacks through missiles and rockets. That was never achieved. It sought to bring Hezbollah to its knees by capitating its leaders and other soldiers within the field in South Lebanon. But Hezbollah quickly regrouped and was able to attack deep into Israel, causing massive losses and massive suffering for the Israeli army and Israeli settlements. By their own account, hundreds of soldiers have been killed, thousands have been injured. We're talking about at least 8,800 homes have been damaged completely, over 7,000 military and other vehicles, as long as 300 farms, as well as many settlements have been totally evacuated. Over perhaps 150,000 people have been evacuated. Part of the goals of Israel was to return these settlers back to their settlements in the north, but that's not to be achieved, even though there is a truce now, because they all be afraid that Hezbollah could come back and attack them, because Hezbollah is still where they are. None of these objectives have been achieved. On top of that, you could also look at their political objectives. They were trying to modify or change UN Security Council Resolution 1701 by putting Israel's conditions on it. They failed to do that. So none of the political and military objectives have been achieved, and that's the clear definition of defeat. If you're unable to realize your political and military objectives that you've announced and declared on day one, then you've been defeated. Of course, we shouldn't make the suffering of the Lebanese people any less. They've killed over 3,800 people, injured thousands of people, over 15,000 people, and that's a great loss. But that's what Israel is good at. That's what Israel is doing in Gaza. They were not able to bring the resistance to their knees. They were not able to defeat Hamas or Islamic Jihad or other resistance groups. All what they did in Gaza was to wage a war of extermination, a genocide in Gaza, killing tens of thousands, injuring hundreds of thousands, and displacing millions. That's what Israel is good at. But for the first time in the history, that after 1 year, this is the longest war by any measures of the Zionist regime against the Palestinians and other resistance groups, and they haven't been able to achieve their goals.
I wanted to ask you about Hezbollah's position and how it has shifted as events on the ground have shifted. In his last address before he was assassinated, Hassan Nasrallah, the general secretary of Hezbollah, said that he would not allow Israel to divide the front, that Hezbollah had entered the conflict in solidarity with the resistance in Gaza, and that there was not going to be any agreement that did not include a ceasefire or a permanent end to the war on the ground in Gaza. Now, of course, his assassination was really what, the pager bombing plot, followed by the radio bombings, followed by this spate of assassinations, including the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah himself, certainly altered some of the reality on the ground. But other Hezbollah officials also indicated that they were going to defer to the resistance in Palestine to lead the way on whether or not there should be a ceasefire. On Monday night, Osama Hamdan, who often is the main spokesperson for Hamas, appeared on Al-Mayadeen television in Lebanon, and he seemed to give the blessing of Hamas to Hezbollah and Lebanon moving forward with an agreement with Israel. And I'll just say one quote from Osama Hamdan on Lebanese television. He said, "Any announcement of a ceasefire in Lebanon is welcomed, as Hezbollah has stood by our people and made great sacrifices." If in fact this sticks and Lebanon and Hezbollah do reach some form of an actual viable truce with Israel, what does that mean then, Dr. Sami Al-Arian, for the resistance in Gaza, for the people of Gaza, for the war against Gaza?
Well, let's recall that Hezbollah joined the fight as a support front on October the 8th, one day after October 7th, and one day after Israel announced that it's going to basically wage a war of genocide against the Palestinians. And they stayed in that capacity. It was a very measured warfare going on in the north. But even with that, Israel wasn't able to handle it. They had to evacuate tens of thousands of people. They took a lot of casualties in the north. And when this was not, when they were not able to withstand that, they waged their own war of aggression after they killed dozens of leaders of Hezbollah, culminating in the martyrdom of Hassan Nasrallah on September the 27th, and then the ground invasion on October 1st. Now, what happened since the October 1st invasion? They were not able to advance very much. They're still in the very south at the border. And Hezbollah fought valiantly after the setbacks they had because of the elimination of the leaders. So what we have today is not a ceasefire. What we have today is a truce. In other words, as a support, Hezbollah went from a support front into an actual front. And when you have an actual front, then the rules of engagement change. They're different. So Hezbollah stopped, but they are still mobilized. They could resume at any moment. And indeed, they need to regroup. They need to bring more arms. And of course, that is going to be faced with Israeli aggression, which could ignite at any time. In other words, yes, Hamas will have more pressure, and the resistance in Gaza will have more pressure, but still, about a third of Israeli army is still in the north. They can't just demobilize and go south. They would have to maintain their presence in the north. That means a large portion of Israeli army would have still to be in the north, which will give some relief for the people in the south, which is Gaza. That's one thing. The other thing is, I think we're going to see more mobilization from the other members of the resistance axis, whether from Yemen, Iraq, Syria, or other places. And I think we have seen also some other people. These are lone wolves, but I think that could also put more pressure on the Israeli state to stop the war. I think there are a lot of political pressures, particularly after the announcement by the ICC for the arrest warrants of Netanyahu and Gallant. So things are happening. Yes, this could be considered as a setback, but it should not be looked at in isolation of the whole scene. Hezbollah is still in the front. Yes, there is a truce, but it's not a ceasefire. It could resume at any moment. Now, in the south, when we look at what's happening, there is a war of attrition. Israel also has not been able to bring the resistance to here. They were not able to, no, they were asking basically for what they call complete or full victory. That's not happening. They haven't been able to defeat the resistance yet, again, despite all the losses and the genocide taking place. And when they're not able to defeat the resistance, that means the resistance is actually still active. Just yesterday, even more rockets were going deep inside Israeli proper. We also saw that there is a war of attrition. They have been suffering tremendously. They haven't been able to bring one hostage out for weeks, despite all these declarations of victories, despite occupying 44% of Gaza today. The resistance is still steadfast. Still, they say that they're not going to accede to any of the Israeli demands until there is a cessation of hostilities, unless there is a genuine ceasefire, plus total withdrawal from Gaza. And that has to be guaranteed by the so-called mediators who have been mediating between the two parties. So my expectation is that this will continue. This war of aggression by Israel will continue. Their killing of innocent women, children, and elderly, and men, and so forth will continue. They have destroyed the total infrastructure of Gaza. They have been waging not only a war, but also starvation policy, as well as the denial of all basic needs to the population. And yet the population is still resilient and determined to stay the course, which is not to give in to Israel. So at one point, Israel would have to stop because of their losses taking place today. There are no more political objectives. There are no more military objectives to be achieved. And I think the situation in the north is going to be very volatile. It could resume at any moment. But I don't sense any surrender on the part of the Palestinian resistance for Israel to declare any type of victory. I think we need just to increase our pressure, public pressure, political pressure, as well as what's taking place in the field today, in order to bring the Israelis to their to realize that since they're not able to do it, they are also suffering as much as the Palestinians. Maybe not as much as the Palestinians when it comes to losses, but when it comes to the strategic losses that Israel has been suffering from, I think they're great. I think it's a pariah state. I think the Palestinians could not do this damage that they did to themselves. There is no other issue today on the face of the earth that could galvanize the four corners of the world. Every capital in the world, every city in the world have said enough is enough. People are saying Palestine should be free. That thing that, who would have imagined a year ago that this kind of an overwhelming support throughout the world would come to the Palestinians? But that's coming because of that resilience that the Palestinians have shown, as well as their determination to resist occupation, resist genocide, and say that we will not give in, we will not surrender.
I also want to just talk a little bit about what happened in the hours leading up on Tuesday to Netanyahu giving his address, urging his ministers to accept this deal. What happened, and we saw it, we've seen Israel do this repeatedly with the Palestinians, and we certainly saw it last year before there was the brief truce, where there was an exchange of captives that went on for some days, where Israel just accelerates its already intense killing campaign and bombing campaign. And what we saw on Tuesday in Lebanon were very, very massive Israeli attacks, hitting a Palestinian refugee camp in the south of Lebanon near Ter. Also heavily bombing areas around Beirut, including outside of Dahiya. In Dahiya itself, they use these fire belt attacks, and people can go and see the video of it. I mean, it's an apocalyptic scene. So the Israelis unleash these massive attacks. And even as Netanyahu was speaking, Israel was continuing these intense attacks. And what Netanyahu said in his remarks, and this is what I want to ask you about, one of the things that he said was that the framework of the agreement allows Israel to continue to attack if they determine that Hezbollah is violating the agreement. And I had noticed something buried in a Haaretz article that came out on Monday that I thought was really telling, because it's so reminiscent of how the Biden administration has dealt with the Palestinians in the so-called ceasefire negotiations. But I'll just read this part of a Haaretz article. It said, during the negotiations, Israel has demanded it receive a letter of guarantee from the United States recognizing Israeli freedom of action on Lebanese soil in the event of any attempt to strengthen Hezbollah or another hostile entity there. Though this document will not be an official part of the agreement, it will act as a kind of supplementary appendix to it. This letter will be delivered to Israel by U.S. President Joe Biden. So if that's true, what the Israelis have managed to pull off is getting Biden to give them a letter that is somehow a kind of secret annex to this agreement that says the ceasefire doesn't actually apply to Israel, but only to the other side, and Israel, can easily fabricate a reason to attack Lebanon. You take that and then you look at the way that Hezbollah initially responded, where they said, we are going to review this closely, and we are not going to accept a deal where Netanyahu has snuck some trap into it. And I think that is what they're referring to. To talk about this dynamic where you have the United States and Netanyahu, and they've done this repeatedly to the Palestinians and to Hamas as well, where they go out and they say, haha, we have a deal. And then Netanyahu announces some insane term, and then the U.S. and Israel turn around and say, oh, Hamas is blocking a ceasefire agreement. This could be part of what is happening here, too.
Well, the United States was never an honest broker or a neutral bystander. The United States has been complicit and part and parcel of this genocidal war against the Palestinians and the war of aggression against the Lebanese. So for someone to come and try to argue that somehow the United States now is becoming a neutral in this fight, or has become an honest broker, obviously is disingenuous. What's happening here is a fig leaf. Israel does not need any justification for its wars of aggression that have been taking place in the region for over decades. They don't need, but he wanted something in which he can go, because he was really pressured in the field militarily, and he wanted to show something to his extremist partners. And there he's trying to say, oh, we could always go back, and here is a guarantee. By then I'd say, does he need really a guarantee, or he needs protection from the U.S.? Since when? I mean, that's never been used before. I mean, the United States gave it to him, but Hezbollah doesn't need to recognize or even acknowledge this. Doesn't matter. What matters is what's being signed. What's being signed is that none of Israel's conditions have been met, none, zero. And that the fact that Israel wanted to change or modify the conditions of 1701 all been rejected. So that the Israel was faced that they're going to have a truce for 60 days and try by the end of the 60 days fulfill the conditions of 1701 in both sides. I don't think Israel will ever fulfill 1701. They've never did that. They've never done that since I guess 2006 when it was approved, when it was passed. So we're probably going to be back. But my prediction is that Israel now knows that they cannot bring Hezbollah to its knees, and therefore they may not resume it. But it was a fig leaf. Now, when it comes to the issue of U.S. and what U.S. wants from this deal, I believe the United States has realized long ago that they could not support Israel in a way that Israel would fulfill its conditions, its objectives. But the administration is so weak and so zealous and so blind that they are unable to put any meaningful pressure to stop this war. So they basically have given Israel free hand to do what it wants in Palestine and Lebanon against non-state actors. But when it comes to Iran, they put their foot forward and said, you're not going to do that. This is our domain. This is our territory. You cannot simply do to Iran because that is going to involve the strategic calculations of the United States. And that's why we saw what happened in Iran. Basically, the United States was taking the lead in this. It's not going to allow Israel. What does that tell us? Tell us that the US is capable of stopping this war, is capable of shutting down this war. But they were not, they didn't do it. Why didn't they do it? Partially because the administration, main figures in this administration are totally Zionist. I don't expect much to change with Trump, but also because of the heavy-handed tactics of the Israel lobby in the United States, but also because of the weak response of the regional states in this part. Let's remember what Bob Woodward said in his book. Blinken was surprised whenever he went to an Arab capital that he was listening to these so-called leaders, and they were urging him basically to let Israel wipe out the Palestinian resistance. We're talking about leaders who have sold out on Palestinians, who have betrayed their peoples, and that is part of the problem. That's the weak response of the region has contributed to Israel's war of genocide. That does not let Israel off the hook. Israel is still the main perpetrator of these crimes, but it contributed to the fact that Israel was so far getting away with it. But I think things are changing after 14 months, almost 14 months of the resistance and the failure of Israel to fulfill its political objectives. They can't run. I mean, they can try everything, but they can't run from the fact that at one point the world is going to have a different reaction, and that they are unable to bring back this image of invincible army, the image of that they could be the hegemon of the region. That image has been shattered forever. I can also argue that on the strategic level, Israel has been defeated. It's been defeated because the whole notion of integrating Israel in the region, which would have culminated last spring with the normalization deal between Saudi Arabia and Israel, which would have been followed up with another normalization deal with the major countries in the Muslim world, particularly Pakistan and Indonesia and other countries, that would have culminated Israel's acceptance throughout the world. That would have probably ended the Palestinian issue as we know it. To fund Al-Aqsa, this operation, even though it was unintended, actually ended this. Who is going to sign anything with a war criminal, an indicted war criminal who's been wanted in at least 124 countries that would probably arrest him the moment he sets foot on them? In addition, look at the image of Israel. Israel is no longer this, the shining city on the hill. Israel today is looked at with disdain throughout the world. Look at the ICJ, who are going to rule that this was, in fact, a genocide, an unprecedented genocide, unseen since probably World War II. So when you look at all these things, look at the economy, the deterioration of the economy, the exhaustion, the reverse immigration, everything you look at, there are huge strategic defeats. But of course, all these have been partially not looked at because of the level of carnage and mayhem and destruction in Gaza.
I wanted to ask you about the political dynamic within, or political dynamics within the Palestinian resistance, the armed resistance, but more broadly the resistance movement in Palestine, and specifically as it relates to what's happened in Gaza. There is very seldom any kind of a nuanced discussion about the perspective of Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad or any of the dozen or so other groups that have participated in one form or another in the fighting over the past year. And I wanted to ask you, Dr. Al-Arian, From a, we all are watching with horror the starvation campaign that Israel is waging, the war of annihilation against the people of the Palestinian people of Gaza, disproportionately also killing women and children. You have 10 children on average every day having at least one of their limbs amputated. You have doctors performing amputations with no anesthetic. I mean, we could talk for hours about the utter horror that's been unleashed on the people of Gaza. But I also wanted to ask you, because it's basically a discussion that is almost never allowed in Western media. Talk about the political dynamics right now, how resistance groups see their position right now in this war as a war against Israel.
I'm going to first take you back to October the 6th, 2023. What was the world like a day before Tufan al-Aqsa? Well, let's start with Gaza. Gaza was under a suffocating siege at that time for 16 years. What does that mean? It means that every single item, in or out, would have to be approved by the Israeli occupation army. And they had this system of measuring how much calories each citizen in Gaza would get. They were basically under effective occupation without being inside the Gaza itself. Even Yahya Sinwar himself, the leader of this Tufan al-Aqsa, he said back in 2018, 2019, under this massively peaceful protest called the Great March of Return, that what we wanted to do is to break this siege and start a truce that could be as long as 10 or 20 years, only to be met with total refusal and rejection by Israel. It didn't want to have any kind of a deal. And the Palestinians were tired of this siege and need to do something. Now look at the prisoners. At that time, there were 5,700 prisoners. These are people who have been jailed, some of them for over 40 years. Many of the privileges, let's say call them privileges or rights, that they gained throughout the decades, when Ben-Gvir became in charge of the prison system as he was in charge of the police early in 2023, he started a new program in which he was taking away all these rights one by one: the right to education, the right for visitation, the right to assemble together, and he started this program in order to put squeeze on them. And they were shouting, particularly to the resistance, do something about this. We can't take it anymore. This is really very difficult for them. But on top of that, they started also arresting women, children, and others under the so-called administrative detention. Hundreds of people were rounded up in the first few months and added to this. And of course, that added the pressure. Look at the West Bank. You had Smotrich in charge, again, another extremist in the cabinet of Netanyahu. He took over and he started this very systematic settlement policy, in which he said publicly, this is not even hidden anywhere, he said publicly that we are going to have 1 million settlers in the next couple of years in the West Bank, and we're going to double that in the next few years. He gave the Palestinians 3 options. He said, if you're a Palestinian, you have really to take one of 3 options. One, you can accept that this is a Jewish state. You would have no civil or political rights. You will be our subjects. You have to submit to us. And if you don't like it, and I expect that, then you can take some compensation and leave. And if you reject both of these options, your third option is death. That's what the Palestinians in the West Bank have been facing. And today he's accelerating this program. He said publicly, along with his other extremists, that they need to annex 60% of what is called Area C in the West Bank. And he has basically let the most vile extremists in the West Bank go running wild, killing, torturing, firebombing, burning crops and cars and houses. And I mean, even the most Zionist administration like the US, even they cannot take it anymore, because it's so in your eyes type of thing, in your face type of things. And even they would try to put some people on their list of sanctions. But that is the policy in the West Bank. Now look at Al-Aqsa Mosque, the most sacred haram, the most sacred religious compound after the 2 holy sites in Saudi Arabia. They have having these incursions, again, led by Ben-Gvir, in which they said that they're going to Judaize that, try to divide the place, in terms of space and time, and they were trying to build their temple on Muslim holy grounds. This was, of course, an act of extreme provocation. Nobody was stopping. Nobody was saying anything. Now, look, I talked about the strategic thing. Netanyahu stood before the United Nations 2 weeks, 15 days before Tufan al-Aqsa, with a map on his hand. And he was drawing a line that started from India all the way to the Indian Ocean, to the Gulf of Oman, the Persian Gulf, and then to the Emirates, from there to Saudi Arabia, Jordan, then to Haifa port, and from there through the Mediterranean to Europe. And he called that the India, Middle East, Europe Economic Corridor. Basically, he's saying we are going to be at the heart of this. The map that he was referring to, which is historical Palestine, had Israel. There was zero mention of any kind of a Palestinian state. Strategically, he was going to sign a deal with Saudi Arabia. He's going to be the hegemon in the region. He's going to guarantee U.S. interests, and he's going to have Israel basically as the country in control of this. Tufan al-Aqsa came and shattered all this. So the Palestinians really had no recourse except to resist. And that's the true meaning of resistance, that they're not going to succumb to Israeli designs and plots, despite the balance of power being heavily against them. Now, what are the Palestinians faced with today? Again, as you see, even politically, no one was talking about two-state solution. I don't think there is a viable two-state solution. But today, even the Biden administration, when they start talking about political settlement, they start starting with the two-state solution. Two-state solution was the ceiling, now it's the floor. But the Palestinians have passed that, I believe. I think Israel is in real trouble. They cannot have a two-state solution. That train has left the station. It is no longer a viable option. They can't have Palestinians leave, despite the genocide, despite the war of extermination, despite the ethnic cleansing. The Palestinians are staying. Today, the number of Palestinians exceed the number of Jews between the river and the sea in historical Palestine. What are they going to do about them? It's another apartheid regime. Sooner or later, the world is going to say enough is enough. That would kill this dream of Zionism to have a Jewish state. They killed it. No one else did. And therefore, all what the Palestinians have to do is to remain steadfast and resilient on their own land until the whole world realizes that there is not going to be peace. There is not going to be tranquility. There is not going to be security in this region until the Palestinians are free. And I think millions, hundreds of millions of people around the world are realizing this. And they're standing up. But they are not the political elite, the corrupt political elites, particularly in Western countries, particularly in the United States, who are realizing this. But sooner or later, the people will say, we are fed up with this, and we need to see a resolution with more resistance, with this global movement galvanizing around Palestinian rights, where Palestine has become the compass, the ruler, the symbol, I would call it the cause of all people who are rallying around justice, who are rallying around freedom. And when that happens, then there will be one inevitable solution, the same we saw in the 80s when it culminated in Nelson Mandela's freedom and eventually in the dismantlement of apartheid in South Africa. I think sooner or later that would be the only plausible solution. Meanwhile, we are going to suffer as Palestinians. The world will have to come to the realization that the suffering of the Palestinians is not going to be in vain. The suffering of the Palestinians would have to culminate in them gaining or regaining their rights.
To follow up with that background, I want to re-ask the question narrowly. What is your understanding of how the leadership of Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, at this moment see their position?
Very simple. They're not going to surrender. They're not going to give up. They're not going to give in. They're not going to surrender. So they realized long ago that even though this may not have been the intention of what happened on October the 7th, I think what Hamas did on October the 7th was so beyond the imagination of those who planned it. They were the victims of their own success. And Israel, of course, took that opportunity in order to unleash its war of extermination and genocide in order to solve its demographic problem, but it failed miserably. So now they have realized that the only way to stop this war of aggression, to stop this genocide, is through resistance. And that's what we're saying on the ground, a war of attrition. Now, there could be one of two outcomes of this. One is that Israel eventually will have to stop and not fulfill its objective of totally defeating the resistance, and that would be a defeat for Israel, or it would have to kill every Palestinian, because at the end, the problem on the ground is not that Hamas and Jihad are running out of men. Actually, it was what Israel is doing is the best recruiting device. People are joining the resistance every single day because of what they have seen. I mean, we're talking about families totally wiped out. What do you think a child who sees his parents and grandparents and brothers and sisters, and he's seeing his neighbors and cousins, he's going to be radicalized. And we're seeing this, and I'm hearing this from many people that they don't have problem recruiting people. And of course, when it comes even to finding the ammunition and the means by which they fight, who would have thought after 14 months they are still capable of hitting and killing the Israeli soldiers who have been nothing but savages? I mean, we've seen the pictures. No one can deny that. So let's say, they kill every Palestinian. Do you think the Palestinians will stop resisting? We still have 14 million Palestinians around the world. There are still over 7 million Palestinians inside. So Israel cannot get out of this by killing every Palestinian. They just can't. And at the end, there would have to be some sort of day of reckoning, day of accountability. And I think that accountability is going to haunt them, because either they will have, again, going back to the three choices that Smotrich and every other Zionist believes in, either they would have to kill every Palestinian, and then they have to deal with hundreds of millions of other people in the region. What are they going to know about that? I mean, we've seen what they're doing in Lebanon. They can't just rule by ruthless, brutal force and think that this is how they're going to survive. They can't survive that way. So at the end, regardless of how you look at it, Zionism is doomed. Zionism, they had one opportunity after Oslo in which there was a process, perhaps one sliver of hope that there could be some sort of a two-state solution, but that very quickly dissipated. And it dissipated because Zionists cannot see others in the same way. They don't see that they could be equal to Palestinians. This is an ideology of supremacism. It's ideology of racism, ideology of settler colonialism. It's an ideology that cannot see itself on equal footing with the other. And therefore, they can't fathom the fact that somehow they can share a land with others, with Arabs, with Palestinians. Even they are Semitic, and the Europeans who came from Europe claiming to be Semitic, they are not. But regardless of that, I think eventually the resistance movements, just to answer your question bluntly, they're gonna continue their resisting with whatever means is possible. And at the end, I think it is the determination, it is the will of which party is more willing to sacrifice to achieve their goals. I believe that we have seen the answer to that. The Palestinians, despite all the suffering and despite all the losses and despite all what they had to go through, they have been basically the more patient part. We've seen tens of thousands of Israelis leave their homes and crying every day. We've seen hundreds of thousands leaving the state, and they are fed up with it. They can't sacrifice having electricity, not having electricity for a few hours a day. Do you think these people are willing to stay in the land with this? I don't think so. I think at the end, the Palestinians are going to be the true owners of the land. They're going to stay there, and those who are invaders will have to leave because they cannot fathom the fact that they would share the land. Now, in terms of the resistance, I tell you the resistance are going to continue until this war is brought to an end.
Yeah, I want to ask you about your thoughts on the potential paths this takes to some form of an end or a resolution. But just to frame the question, Donald Trump is going to be president of the United States in short order. He has put together a national security team that is united in their full support of Israel's genocidal war. Even some of the people that are viewed as potential outsiders to to that world or to the national security establishment, like former Congressperson Tulsi Gabbard, has used Bush and Cheney era war on terror language, talking about going to war against an ideology of Islamist terrorism, not just a war against like actual terrorist cells, but to go to military war against an ideology. And she would have been the one person that people could have pointed to and said, oh, this might be somebody who might think differently about some of these issues, but they're all united in it. You have Mike Huckabee, a fanatical Christian Zionist who's going to be the U.S. ambassador to Israel. He has said that there's no such thing as a Palestinian, that there's no such land as the West Bank. Trump himself, received an enormous amount of money, his campaign, from Miriam Adelson, who wants the West Bank officially annexed. We had, Joe Biden, if you rewind some months ago, there were all these stories in the press about how the Biden administration was trying to work out a plan for post-war governance and administration of Gaza. People were talking about trying to sort of revitalize the Palestinian Authority. I think everyone knows that Mahmoud Abbas has rock bottom popularity levels. He's extremely old. People view largely the Palestinian Authority as a decrepit, corrupt agent of the Israeli occupation, in general. But what would an end to this look like? It's the most basic question. And anytime I see it asked on corporate television, the answers are so ahistorical, ill-informed, and the stuff of kind of fantasy. But you've spent your life immersed in this as a Palestinian, as someone who was forced to live without an ability to go to your homeland, and now you do it as a matter of academic pursuit as well. What do you see the potential ends to this looking like in both short and long term?
No one is under the illusion that somehow Trump is going to end this in any way that would be favorable or even give the Palestinians some of their stolen rights. No one believes that. We've seen him. He's not like an unknown quantity. We've seen him during his first administration and the policies that he had pursued in terms of recognizing the legitimate grip of the Zionists over Jerusalem. We've seen him how he basically stopped the funding of UNRWA, which is being continued now by the Israeli state, how they trying to illegitimize, to make UNRWA illegitimate. This is the organization that was set up after the Nakba in order to help Palestinian refugees. That policy started during Trump. The U.S. used to provide 1/3 of its budget. Trump cut off that budget. He also reneged on all the promises that the previous U.S. administrations had given to the Palestinian Authority, which is itself was set up by the United States and the Quartet in order to support a flawed process called Oslo, which sought to bring about an end to this tragedy, to this Palestinian tragedy. So, in the so-called deal of the century that Trump championed back during his last year of his first term, all the conditions that that Netanyahu and the Israeli state has set up, he has adopted. So I can't imagine that he's going to be any different. Now add to that the people that he has assembled to be the voices of this administration. You can add to that also the Secretary of Defense designee, except in which basically he says openly that he wants a crusader. He was an American Israeli crusader against Muslims in the region. I mean, he speaks in the language of Armageddon. He speaks in the language of total defeat of every single state in this region, even those who are considered allies of the United States. So when you have this kind of people in one administration, you can't expect anything good. I mean, this is going to be a huge challenge for the standing of America in this region. So what do we expect? That's the essence of your question. I think people have to realize we have to go back to the essence of the conflict. The essence of the conflict is that the Jewish communities in Europe had faced throughout centuries discrimination, persecution, and sometimes even pogroms and Holocaust in Europe. And their solution was, in the age of the nation-state system, is that the only way to deal with this racism, this racist attitudes by Europeans towards us, is to establish our own homeland. That was the start of a Zionist movement. They didn't care where, but they found that many Jews yearned to go back to the Holy Land, and therefore they adopted Palestine. And they established, with the adoption of imperialist powers, at the time it was England and now it's the United States, that we can support this project because this project could be implanted in the midst of the Arab and Muslim world. And after they divided and fragmented this world, they thought, okay, we can really have the upper hand on this region. We can steal its wealth, we can take its oil, we can prop up these regimes which we control. So this region would always be under our thumb. That's the reality of the situation, and we have all kinds of evidence to show it. The problem, of course, is that Palestine was not a land without a people. Palestine had Palestinians, and they were the true owners and inhabitants and the indigenous people of the land. And whatever they did to them, they didn't leave. They insisted on remaining, even though 80% of the Palestinians were expelled from the areas that Israel occupied in 1948. And that created the Nakba, the first catastrophe of the Palestinians. But the Palestinians kept resisting. They kept not accepting this imposed reality on them. They wanted to go back. These Palestinians in 1948 were 1.3 million. Today, they are probably over 15 million. And that's over 10 times. And they want to go back to their lands. So what are they going to do about this? The Jews, even that the Zionists were able to bring into Palestine, were less than the total number of Jews worldwide. So even Zionism failed first to bring all the Jews, and second, it failed to bring security. And therefore, they are in a conundrum. They cannot guarantee the security that they promised the Jews inside. And they think that they can basically have the whole land to themselves by imposing a harsh realities on the Palestinians, so they give up. I've seen many reports in the past in which they have all kinds of solutions in which they can transfer the Palestinians to Sinai, they can transfer the Palestinians to Jordan, they can exile the Palestinians to other parts of the world. Even some people are thinking of Canada and Australia and others. No one is asking, the Palestinians whether they would agree to be replaced for what? I mean, what are the basis by which you can transfer millions of people from the lands that they lived in throughout millenniums in order to satisfy this movement that is nothing but a supremacist, racist, settler colonial movement? And therefore, until the Zionists in Palestine and outside realize that their nightmare, I wouldn't call it a dream, of having Israel, greater Israel, in order to play this role of the hegemon of the region is defeated, then that conflict would continue. The Palestinians will insist on restoring their rights. Now, the Israelis had three choices. They want to call themselves democratic, and they want to call themselves a Jewish state. Well, to combine both of these, that means you have to have a Jewish majority in some land, and that would have been the two-state solution. But they totally rejected that. And when Oslo started back in 93, and it was supposed to conclude in 99, because 94 it started, 99 would have ended. They would have given the Palestinians 22% of Palestine, of historical Palestine. That would have been the historical compromise that the official PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, have agreed to, even though the Palestinians were never consulted on that. But their leadership decided, okay, we better, get something. But that never materialized because the Zionists didn't want to share anything. So they made sure that none of these proposals would come to fruition. They're not going to give up Jerusalem. They're not going to give up the West Bank. They're not going to give up anything. The Palestinians are defeated. The Palestinians are the weaker part. They have to basically accept defeat and go. Well, the Palestinians did not accept defeat and go. So that meant that the next possibility would be for people in that part of the world, between the river and the sea, in the historical Palestine, all 26,000 plus kilometers squared, would be shared by both peoples. You have to realize that today the number of Palestinians exceed the number of Jews. That means if you have one man, one vote, like you had in South Africa, if you give the Palestinians the right to be full citizens, that eventually that Zionist state will cease to exist. Yes, you will have almost equal number of Palestinians and Jews. Then you could have some sort of a political settlement, maybe confederation, maybe some kind of coexistence. But the Zionists don't want to share anything because, again, of their supremacist mentality, they cannot fathom the fact that they can share the land with anyone else. If that ever happens, maybe many of them, perhaps even the majority, would leave the land and go. So they're not going to give up easily, and they're going to fight till the last person until they make sure that Palestinians will not get anything. So where does that leave us? Well, that left us with an apartheid state, where you have one group dominating the other group. And that's what the Palestinians have been living under now for decades. You have to understand this has been 76 years. And since the 1967 war, where all the Palestinians now under the occupation of Israel, this has been 57 years. So how many generations would the Palestinians live under this condition? So Israel had a problem. It cannot declare itself Jewish and democratic by still having Greater Israel. So they didn't know what to do that. The world was looking the other way, particularly the United States, that somehow you need to find a solution. During the waning days of Obama, that's basically what Obama and Kerry were saying. You know, where you're going, where you're heading. Do you think you're going to get away with this forever? You better do something while you have some peaceful situation, because if not, this thing is going to blow up in your face. And exactly that's what happened in last year. So they had the option now. They saw that this is a historic opportunity to get rid of their demographic problem. And they want to do that through ethnic cleansing. They don't want to be called an apartheid state. That third option is not acceptable. So they try to find the fourth option. And that fourth option is ethnic cleansing and genocide. But that even failed. So after 1 year of total destruction and killing and targeting of every single infrastructure in Gaza, hospitals, houses, clinics, mosques, churches, markets. I mean, you name it. It's universities, schools. The Palestinians didn't leave. They didn't go anywhere. I mean, they are suffering a tremendous amount of suffering, and yet they're not going anywhere. People in the West Bank not going anywhere. So that failed. Where does that leave us? What would be the end solution? Well, the end solution, obviously, is going to be continuation of resistance until the Israelis would realize that the Palestinians are not second-class citizens. They are humans, they're not subhumans, and they will insist on gaining their rights. And when that happens, then the Israelis will be faced with the option of either staying there, sharing the land, giving the Palestinians full rights, or they would have probably to pack up and go. And go where? Well, almost half of the Israelis have second passports. I think, I'm not calling for this, but I think most of them will probably, as many have decided to do that. And many of them, many of my Israeli friends also, they have second passports, and they decided they're not going to live there anymore. And they just left. They left to England, they left to Germany, they left to the United States, left to other places. These are good ones, but there are many others who are not, who were not there in the first place, actually, for any kind of messianic vision. They were just there because they had good life. But right now, that good life is not there. So sooner or later, there will be a global movement that will stand up for the rights of the Palestinians. And as the Palestinians stand up for their rights, there's going to be an alignment between this global movement against tyranny, against oppression, against injustice. These people will stand up for the rights of the Palestinians. Israel, sooner or later, will crack up. I've studied this in details. Israel is built on 12 imperatives. These are the sources of strength. I don't have time to go over them. But when you look closely at these 12 imperatives, it is like a house that has 12 columns. Now, all these columns could crack up. And when that happens, then the whole Zionist regime would collapse. And when that Zionist regime collapses in the same way that apartheid collapsed in South Africa, the only thing left would be for a new system in that system would recognize the humanity and would recognize the rights of everyone living in that land, and that would be the future. But to get there, from here to there will be a lot of suffering. There will be a lot of sacrifices. There are going to be many people who will lay their life for this to happen, unfortunately, because that's the nature of evil. That's the nature of imperialism. That's the nature of people who think of themselves to be better than the others. They're not going to give up easily. They're going to kill until they are totally defeated.
We don't have much time left, but just one point on this. I mean, what you're speaking about is the long arc of history and the potential future. But in the immediate future, you have Biden not backing off of this support. Israel is continuing to just kill large numbers of Palestinians in Gaza. There's a very real threat that Israel could announce a formal annexation of the entirety of the West Bank. You have Trump's people coming in that are going to continue backing this Israeli state's wars against the Palestinians. It doesn't seem like in the short term any of those things are going to be on the agenda. It seems like mass killing, annexation, settlements are going to be front and center in the U.S.-backed agenda in Israel. So I guess what I'd like briefly your take on is there, how does this acute moment come to an end, or is what you're arguing that it is not going to come to an end, that there's going to be an expansion of the resistance? Are you predicting then that there isn't going to be a truce in Gaza or some political resolution whatsoever anytime in the near future at all?
Well, there's a difference between truce and the end of hostilities and a real political settlement. I don't think these go hand in hand. I think what's going to happen is that at one point Israel's going to stop, and Netanyahu is going to go to prison, or at least he's going to step down. When that happens, we're going to be back to where we were for decades, which is we have one group trying to dominate the other group. The other group is trying to resist this power struggle, this dominance, and that struggle would continue. And I think when you go back and study the Palestinian resistance since its inception, but particularly since the Intifada of 1987 and forward, you'll find that the Palestinians always have gained and had different ways of resisting. And I think the Israelis have been the ones actually giving up, even though their brutality increases. But the Palestinians are steadfast, are determined to continue this resistance. Now, what could happen? Let's say they annex, so what? I mean, as if they're not in control, they're not in occupation. So they go and say, okay, we are now we annex Nablus and Ramallah and Hebron, which they are in control of, and Tulkarem and Jenin. What are they going to do with the Palestinians? So if they annex it, does that mean the Palestinians are no longer there? They are there. It will be even more vivid, more plain, more clear to the whole world what's going on there. This is not the illusion of having some sort of a fake political process taking place that's going to end the Palestinian suffering. It has been fake all along. Now it becomes even clearer to everybody. And I think many European countries today, Spain, Ireland, Belgium, others, have realized that they have been basically helping and sponsoring Israeli belligerents. And they said enough is enough. And they saying to Israel, you need to withdraw. You need to give the Palestinians their rights. The Israelis will continue their belligerence because of the support of the United States. Okay, they want to annex. Let's see what happens when they annex. Do you think things will change? Will not change. Actually, it will become even more problematic for them. And I think the whole world will start seeing the Israeli Zionist project for what it is, a colonial settler project that's trying to replace the Palestinians with others. And they will not stand up to it. And what are they going to do then? I mean, there is only one plausible solution, is to end this racist regime. And when they put all the pressure on this racist regime, then the whole project will implode. The whole Zionist project will implode. And then we'll start to see a semblance of a real solution, which is the Palestinians would stay on their land, will live on their land as free citizens. What happens to the Zionists or to the Jews there, it's up to them. They can stay there and share the land, or they leave. It's really up to them. But they do not have a right to stay there at the expense of the Palestinians. The Palestinians are the true owners of the land. They insist on being in their land, and any other notion that somehow God is a real estate agent that has given this right to Jews everywhere is just crazy. And we're not going to stand up. We're not going to believe in it or stand up to it or accept it. And the Palestinians have made that very clear throughout their resistance of the past century.
Well, Dr. Sami Al-Arian, there's many other things I wanted to ask you about, but we'll have to save it for another time. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Sami Al-Arian is the director of the Center for Islam and Global Affairs at Istanbul Zaim University. That does it for this episode. Make sure to follow us on our new podcast feed by searching for Dropsite News wherever you get your podcasts. Also, please do leave us a rating or review. It helps other people to find us. Our show today was produced by Jose Olivares. If you want to support our work, you can subscribe to dropsitenews.com. You can also make a 501c3 tax-deductible donation to our work by going to dropsitenews.com. At least until Donald Trump and the Democrats have a new law that starts going after nonprofits and they start labeling nonprofits as terror supporters. But do make a donation if you can support our work. You can also click on ways to give on our website. Make sure to follow us on social media platforms. Tell your friends, even your foes, about our work. This program was made possible in part by a grant from The Intercept. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, I'm Jeremy Scahill.